You want to finish what you started? You came to the right place. Them girls that you came with, you might have to part with. Depending on how this thing shakes. Wauwatosa, Kenosha, Oconomowoc is in the house. And a few other cities with indigenous...
Okay, welcome to another episode of The New Look, where we are going to be taking a new look at the Supreme Court and a variety of other issues with Ilya Shapiro. Ilya, what's going on? Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. This is only my, I think, fifth or sixth Zoom, Skype, whatever remote call today, so it's a light day.
That's right. Is this where you spent most of your time? Where are you broadcasting from right now?
My home in Falls Church, Virginia. It's the last stop off the interstate inside the Beltway in metropolitan Washington, D.C. And yeah, this is where the magic happens. I got my bookshelves on this side. I got my bookshelves and my pet shark on the other side.
Are those, your audio quality is very good, by the way. I appreciate that. Are those
I just knocked over my can of Coke. So if you'll excuse me, I need to get some paper towels and things as I was rotating my computer.
This is all staying in.
Okay, hold on a sec.
I'm going to comment on the books on your bookshelf. Okay, so Ilya has what appears to be a copy of Whittaker Chambers' Witness, which I also have on my bookshelf behind me. He has a Ronald Reagan book. I don't know which one it is. I can't tell from the cover. He has a Dwight.
All right, this is literally the first time this has happened in 6 months pandemic. So
Ilya, I've been commenting on your bookshelf, and I noticed you have a copy of Witness by Whittaker Chambers, as do I, behind me. You have an Eisenhower bobblehead. Is that Eisenhower or who is that?
That's Eisenhower. Okay.
I have a variety of Eisenhower paraphernalia behind me. I didn't know which Reagan book that was.
That is the Dinesh D'Souza book. I think there's others behind it. This is
favorite book of all time. Usually we get to this at the end of the podcast, but
I like this was a good one. P.J. O'Rourke, my favorite client. How the hell did this happen? P.J. was my client on a few of Cato's funny briefs. If you look it up, but he didn't write a single comma, but he joined them because they make fun of stupid government regulations and censorship and things like that. And I told PJ that he's an H.L. Mencken fellow with the Cato Institute where I work, and I told him that he's worth every penny we pay him. It's an honorary position, and he says, "That's great, Ilya. You're worth every penny as a lawyer that I pay. I'm pro bono counsel, so we're even."
So when Ilya's not deliberately spilling Coca-Cola on copies of the Constitution on his desk, he's commenting on the Constitution as a distinguished scholar and director of the Robert A. Levy Center for Constitutional Studies at the Cato Institute. He publishes the Cato Supreme Court Review. He's done a lot of other things, and most recently published a book called Supreme Disorder, Judicial Nominations, and the Politics of America's Highest Court. But before we get into that, Ilya, let's start with where are you from? Where does this journey begin?
Sure. I was born in Moscow, Russia, or Moscow, USSR. My family fled in 81. We were able to get out.
And how old were you in 81?
I turned 4 during the immigration process in Italy. So the way it worked for Jewish emigres at the time was if you're going straight to Israel, you went straight to Israel after a Red Cross health inspection in Vienna. Otherwise, you went to Rome, where there was temporary refugee housing, and you waited for a visa from a Western country. And we got that from Canada after about 4 months. And so I grew up in a small town in Ontario, about an hour and a half from Toronto. And we were the only Jewish family in the town. There was one Chinese family, one Indian family. So guess whose kids won all of the academic awards, things like that. Luckily, I was also into sports, so I didn't get beat up. But anyway, it was a very classic Midwestern upbringing. Riding bikes everywhere and Boy Scouts and sports and all the rest of it. And then we moved to Toronto when I started high school. I went to a very good school there, and then went to Princeton, our alma mater. In fact, later this afternoon, my last Zoom call will be for the Princeton chapter of the Federalist Society. I'm doing a thing on freedom of speech for them. And then
didn't you just criticize the the president of Princeton?
Yeah, I was very disappointed. Chris Eisgruber, the current president of Princeton, has generally been very good, kind of an old school liberal approach to all this great awakening and whatnot. But I don't know if you got this email. It was an all alumni email that he sent out last week, basically bending the knee to the demands of the woke mobs, and very unfortunate. And a math professor at Princeton wrote a piece in Newsweek today excoriating him for basically bringing in the thought police and the re-education camps from his native Romania. And I agreed with that. A colleague and I are actually another Princeton alum are working on a private letter to send to President Eisgruber, because this is really, it's not even that I'm mad, I'm just sad.
Okay, so before we get into excoriating our alma mater, and I didn't get that email. I must not be on the email list. I get the Princeton Alumni Weekly, and every issue has like someone who's gone into politics, and it's always like, bravely running for city council here or there. And I've never been contacted for an interview.
There's another political cover. I just got one today. It's someone from a class of 06. I haven't opened it up of what she's running for or what she's doing, but yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
I don't know if any Republican has been contacted. Okay. Do you have memories of Moscow? I mean, what is it in your mind? Is it what is it like?
So I've been back twice. I was back in '98 to do thesis research when I was at Princeton, and then in '09 for the thesis research was about a month. It was fascinating, and that was when the currency collapsed and the debt default in the summer of '98. Fascinating place to be running around as a 21-year-old talking to constitutional experts and politicians and whatnot. Anyway, and then I was back in '09 on a Jewish young professionals trip. So I've sort of backfilled memories with my adult experiences. But yeah, I did visit the what was the communal apartment where I spent my first 3, nearly 4 years, just to make clear, in Moscow at the time, running out of housing shortage. And so a lot of people shared their apartment spaces. So we had a 1-bedroom where the bedroom was occupied by a nice old lady who was not a member of our family. And my parents and I'm an only child, as are most Soviets of my generation, slept in the living room, and then we shared the kitchen and bathroom. And so I visited that place. It had been privatized, of course, and a bachelor was living there. It was perfectly fine bachelor quarters, but I can't imagine, raising a family.
Wow. So most Soviets of that generation only had one child because of economic constraints, or like deliberate government policy?
I know, absolutely. There was no one-child policy like in China. It was economic constraints. It was, very hard, very tough. My parents were saints. They, stood in lines to get whatever morsel of nutritious food came in from wherever that particular day. I mean, it's tough. And they were educated folks. My mom has a PhD. My dad's an engineer, and but that's why they got me out. My dad had long wanted to leave. He had been exiled as a kid under Stalin when his father was arrested for being educated and Jewish and things like that, enemy of the people. And so he didn't get to go back to Moscow until he started college in the thaw after Khrushchev. But he, obviously hated the regime, wanted to get out. And it wasn't until I was born that my mom was like, yeah, we can't raise this boy here. So I thank my dad. My mom passed when I was in college, but my dad's still in Toronto, and I talk to him almost every day, and yeah, just I think about how different my life would be if they hadn't made that call.
Well, the tragedy though is they go through all this trouble, taking you away from an evil communist regime, only to trap you in another in Canada.
Well, we just took a wrong turn at the St. Lawrence Seaway, and I liked immigrating so much I had to do it another time. But, the American immigration system is so screwed up that it wasn't until 10 years ago that I finally got my green card, 5 years ago that I became a citizen. And Mike, it's like most immigrants, I do a job that most native-born Americans won't, and that's defending the Constitution.
Touche, sir. Touche. Okay, but I guess this leads to a thought of, because of your family's unique experience, what drew you to studying the U.S. Constitution? Was it a sense of, maybe the fact that you kind of initially came at America from abroad gave you a unique perspective on it and appreciation for it? When did that first kind of manifest itself.
Yeah, I do think I have the zealotry of a convert in a sense. My parents, as I said, were Soviet trained engineers, so I was always good at math and that. But when it became clear that I was more interested in history and writing and what have you, my parents were like, all right, that we came to this country so you could choose what you could do. We didn't have so many opportunities, but that's great. But you have to understand, we can't help you with your homework anymore. And I said, yeah, that's fine. I got this. But yeah, I was just, I was drawn, my parents taught me that communism was bad, and I basically took it from there. And in terms of the U.S. versus Canada, I always, from an early age, preferred, it sounds hokey perhaps, but I preferred life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to peace, order, and good government, the relative mottos of the countries. And I think early on I wanted to go to law school. After Princeton, I did a grad school in London at the LSE, and then law school at the University of Chicago.
Were you one of these like smart Rhodes Scholar kids or something? Or
I was not a Rhodes Scholar, although the Canadian Rhodes is relatively easier to get than the American Rhodes, so maybe I should have tried. But I got a couple of other scholarships that I cobbled together and spent my year traveling around Europe and playing rugby and going to theater and things like that. But I always knew I wanted to go to law school. I always had this kind of comparative constitutional bent interest in political institutions, and just really got taken with constitutional structure. And when I clerked for a federal circuit judge in Jackson, Mississippi, and then came to D.C. I've been in the D.C. area for 16 years now. And I was kind of miserable in big law firms trying to write on the side, and got this opportunity to join Cato. It'll be 13 years tomorrow, in fact, since I've been at Cato. And away we went. And it's just, the promise of this country, the way that the Madisonian genius of the way that the checks and balances and separation of powers and federalism, which has been observed largely in the breach in the last 80 years or so, but that's getting into my book a little bit. But I was always just, man's last best hope for freedom. The speeches of Ronald Reagan, I was a precocious, 8, 9, 10, 12-year-old listening to all that stuff, just couldn't get enough. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall, and the wall came down. And yeah, so the background that I came from certainly influenced my wanting to contribute to making or keeping this country free.
So presumably, just as there were millions trapped on the wrong side of that wall, there are millions of miserable law school grads trapped at soulless law firms right now. And I have not met someone who enjoys working. What advice would you give to them? How did you make that decision to presumably forego, a partner track and kind of go on this different think tank writing track? And how did you wind up working in Iraq as part of that transition?
Yeah. Well, I actually wasn't that good an associate, so maybe I wouldn't have made it through the partner track. Tending to the laborious minutiae when I wanted to think big thoughts and work on maybe I should have gone to a different kind of firm to do more white shoe appellate litigation or something. But then
you never billed enough hours. You felt
guilty. That too. I suppose. But the thing is, I would just go home, and even when I was like finished supervising document review or whatever it was at midnight, 1 a.m., and I'd have to like write an op-ed or a blog post or something. And this is in the early days of online publication in like 04, 05, 06. And I always thought I wanted a career that had a blend of public sector, private sector, nonprofit teaching, what have you. And this opportunity presented itself because I'd building up a clip file of publications in various places, and attending think tank lectures, Capitol Hill cocktail parties, trying to maintain knowledge and connections in the policy and political worlds. And I went to a Bradley lecture at AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, asked a question. I always tell my interns, make sure when you go to these things, you ask questions, assuming it's an intelligent question. That line about how there are no dumb questions is absolutely wrong. But anyway, I asked a good one. And then Roger Pilon, the founder of Cato's Constitutional Studies Center, came up to me at the Wine and Cheese afterwards and said, hey, that was a good question. I think I recognize your name from somewhere. Why don't you send me your resume or what have you? And it had only been a year since I changed firms, so I wasn't necessarily looking for a new job, but he had me over for lunch for a 3-hour-long discussion of political philosophy and legal theory, and away we went. Except I'd already made arrangements to go to Iraq, as you mentioned, for a few months, because I had met Dave Petraeus at a Princeton alumni conference on rule of law development. And I came up to him after this, after he gave a talk. This is before he got definitely before he got his fourth, maybe even before he got his third star, while he was working on the counterintelligence manual at Leavenworth. And I said, look, I didn't even have a green card at the time. I was on a NAFTA visa. So I'm like, look, with my immigration status, I can't go work for the CIA. I can't go work for you. What can I do? I'm interested in this, institution building process. And he's like, I don't know. Let's see what we can do. And long story short, they found a way to get me there unpaid, but I had cleverly negotiated with my law firm to continue my associate salary while I was in Iraq, because they thought it would be good for their government contract practice and whatever else. But then I got this offer to join Cato, and so halfway through my time living in a trailer in the Green Zone beside Saddam's palace, I gave my notice by email to the managing partner of the firm and came back, cleaned out my office, and away we went. But in Iraq, I was basically an aide plenipotentiary, if you will, of the staff judge advocate, the head JAG, Mark Martins, who's now for a while been the head prosecutor at Guantanamo. Remarkable individual, top of his class at West Point, Rhodes Scholar, Harvard Law. I mean, just brilliant individual. And I would do everything from like reading biographies of Saddam to try to get insight into political processes or cults of the individual, to writing memos on the Iraqi criminal code, to coordinating PowerPoint presentations between different lawyers working in the rule of law space. It was really fascinating. And of course, I wasn't eligible for any security clearance. Canadians weren't part of the Allied forces there, and so I would give some presentation, and Colonel Martins would say, "Oh, you did a good job with that. Now forget anything about that presentation that you just gave." So
it'll suddenly become classified for no reason.
Right.
Well, Petraeus, this was his, I think, particular genius, a willingness and ability to reach outside or down through the bureaucracy to recruit talent wherever he found it, particularly through various alumni networks. Wait, just to quickly go back before we get into your book. So you went to University of Chicago for law school. I sort of view, and without knowing much about it, University of Chicago, both law school and undergrad, as occupying, like being this unique island of common sense and small L liberal thought in an otherwise crazy sea of wokeness and big L liberal and big W woke thought. Am I correct in that suspicion?
I think that's right, although they're bending as well. I mean, not
Really?
as much as some of these other places, but Chicago was the place that originated the free speech. I don't know what you call it, but the Chicago Statement on the Freedom of Speech, which was adopted actually by Princeton. Maybe they'll now be going back from that, but not all schools did. And certainly at the law school, there was a lot of intellectual freedom and a lot of intellectual diversity. Less of that after Elena Kagan, now justice, of course, but when she was dean of Harvard, would poach a lot of conservatives from Chicago because she liked intellectual diversity. And that was one of the ways in which she was an excellent dean of Harvard Law School. Yeah, Chicago's an interesting place. It's definitely, the unofficial motto is where fun comes to die or hell does freeze over. I mean, there's a lot of work. It's a nose to the grindstone, particularly for the undergrads relative to their peer institutions. But I found the law school a fulfilling place, and particularly my third year when I moved up north and lived right next to Wrigley Field, between Wrigley Field and the lake. Really enjoyed it, and made a lot of good friends, made a lot of intellectual connections, and I think that education has served me well as kind of to polish off what I got at Princeton and in London.
So, final life question before moving on to serious matters. So, as a Soviet exile turned Canadian turned Chicagoan turned DC-in, what are your sports allegiances?
Yeah, this is somewhat controversial. So for hockey, you got to talk about hockey first, of course. It's both the Leafs that I grew up with and the Washington Capitals, where I've been a season ticket holder for 12 years. Well, how can this be? How can you be a sports bigamist? This is anathema. Well, I just told you my story. I grew up with hockey. I actually grew up cheering for Wayne Gretzky and his Edmonton Oilers when the Leafs were terrible. And so that's why my football team became the Denver Broncos, because they shared the same colors as the Edmonton Oilers randomly. I've held allegiance to both the Capitals and the Leafs because, they're not rivals. In fact, until 3 years ago, they'd never met in the playoffs. But that first meeting in the playoffs, that was a true dilemma. In fact, I went to the arena here in D.C. and I safety pinned together two halves of my jerseys for the Leafs and the Caps. A reporter for the Washington Post took a picture of me entering the arena and like tweeted it out saying, what fresh hell is this? That got picked up by the NBC on NHL. I was like interviewed at the post-game show and eventually made not too many think tank scholars can say this, made the front page of the sports section of the Washington Post, or at least my jersey did. This whole story about how, I moved to DC, met a girl, settled down, and here we are. And people ask, so who did you end up cheering for in that series? And I said, the home team. So
first of all, I will allow the Broncos thing because I have very strong thoughts on this. I think your sports allegiances should generally be inherited or geographically determined. But in cases like I imagine where you were in Canada, where you don't
Toronto
have
doesn't have an NFL team,
you are allowed to.
And the Bills were losing 4 Super Bowls in a row,
Yeah.
so there's no way I was going to go for that.
Exactly.
And in baseball, surprisingly enough, I was exposed to Fenway Park at a formative age, so I became a Red Sox fan. Now, again, living in D.C., I feel I can afford to be a Nationals and a Red Sox as they're opposite leagues, but,
Quickly, you said a phrase, what fresh hell is this? The only other time I've heard that phrase is in a Western set in Australia called The Proposition. What does that phrase come from? Or is that just something that is a thing?
I don't know. I'm an autodidact. I pick up all sorts of things, just like my 3 seersucker suits that I own. And I start, if you were from Mississippi, not Wisconsin, I'd be in a heavy drawl right now. I just, adapt the cultural chameleon stuff.
Okay, so owing in no small part to that very unique life experience, Ilya has written a ton. I would encourage you to go on Cato's website to get a flavor for it, but most recently published a book called Supreme Disorder, and I'm going to read the second part of that title, Judicial Nominations and the Politics of America's Highest Court. I don't really know where to begin. Maybe begin at the end with Kavanaugh, because I think that's probably most vivid in everyone's mind. I mean, obviously we saw a very brutal, nationally divisive confirmation hearing. Maybe if you would just kind of situate that within the overall evolution of confirmations and what it says about the court.
Sure.
Or do start somewhere else. I don't know.
Kavanaugh, by the way, Trump apparently just put out his SCOTUS list, so I'm gonna, as soon as we finish talking, I'm gonna have to analyze what's going on with that.
Are you on the list?
I don't think so. Otherwise, I would be getting other kinds of media queries. But so Kavanaugh didn't happen out of thin air. This was kind of the latest escalation in a series of ratcheting up of tensions over the Supreme Court. There's some people that feel that none of the Republican-appointed justices are legitimate. Roberts and Alito, because Bush, didn't really win the election in 2000. Thomas, because of his earlier, scandal of his hearing in 91, and then Gorsuch and Kavanaugh because Trump similarly is illegitimate, and also Merrick Garland was blocked and all that. So, there have been escalations going back decades. It doesn't really matter who started it, who's more to blame, but it's this battle for the courts happens because what the courts do matter. And so we have the culmination of this trend where we have divergent interpretive theories mapping onto partisan preferences at a time when the parties are more ideologically sorted than they've been perhaps ever, at least since the Civil War. And given that there's only a finite number of seats, even if you expand the court to whatever, there's still a finite number of seats, you're going to have brought battles over this thing. And so, senators are responding to the incentives that they face, and nominees are responding to the incentives that they face. But ultimately, and this goes back historically, this is not just the modern age, the single biggest indicator of whether somebody is going to be confirmed or how easily is whether the party that controls the White House, the president making the nomination, also controls the Senate. Historically, about 90% of unified government picks are confirmed and about 60% of divided government picks. And you add to that with the Merrick Garland situation, if it's the last year of a presidential term, those are about 50%, not, without separating out divided versus unified. So You get these kind of statistics, and you get the political fights going back to George Washington, who had one of his nominees rejected, and it's no surprise that we get the dirty kind of all hands on deck, no holds barred fights over what is ultimately could be a deciding vote on so many important issues.
But you start the book with this story about John Kennedy's nomination to the Supreme Court, who, and I'm going to forget the name, but was the highest paid player in the NFL.
Byron White, probably the last person who's going to play in the NFL while a student at Yale Law School.
That's a safe prediction, right? But the point you make is that this was kind of over in an afternoon. He got some very tame questions, mostly about his football career, and then there wasn't really even a debate, and then he was confirmed. So I guess tease out a little bit what's changed in the intervening 60 or so years. Is it that at that time there weren't two clearly divergent theories, legal theories, for what a good justice should be? Originalists versus what's the phrase we use to lump all the left in right now?
Living constitutionalists.
Or is it more just the parties are the country's more divided and the party tactics reflect that? Maybe it's overdetermined and there's a lot of different things, but kind of tease out the difference between that vignette and Kavanaugh.
Yeah, I mean, originalism didn't really exist. The conservative legal movement didn't really exist. And we were still only 20 years from what legal scholars call the Revolution of 1937, really kind of 37 to 42 or so, when the Constitution was amended in a whole host of ways by the Supreme Court, or by the FDR administration, and the Supreme Court allowed them to get away with it, expanding federal power under the power to regulate interstate commerce, the Commerce Clause, or the General Welfare Clause, which is meant to be a restriction of federal power to those things that are actually benefit the general as opposed to the particular or regional welfare, other such things, as well as a bifurcation of our rights and how those rights are connected textually to either the Bill of Rights or the 14th Amendment. You have a divergence starting in the late 30s, early 40s, which would really blossom in the Warren Court, which was the 60s and 70s. Not quite yet visible in 1962, although there was some pushback to some of the desegregation orders. That was the main controversy at the time. And of course, the issue of civil rights split the Democratic Party. And so you'd have kind of cross-partisan concerns, although not for Byron White. LBJ would run into this with some of his nominees, and then Nixon beyond. But then really the conservative legal movement, as nascent as it was in those days, made a strategic error in replying to the what they call the activism of the Warren or FDR court, not by saying your legal theories are wrong, but by saying you're activist. You should be restrained. And so we got this bizarre fight for decades over judicial modes. That is, are you being restrained enough, or no, you're being activist, or what have you, rather than your theory of the First Amendment is wrong, your theory of the Commerce Clause is wrong. And so it's only lately in the last 20, 25 years that, in addition to kind of developing the rigorous intellectual structure of originalism and textualism, which Robert Bork started, then Scalia, and then a whole bunch of scholars got into the act, understanding that first of all, that it's not about the intention of the framers. Try to figure out what James Madison had to say about violent video games or something. It's more the words on the page and what they meant when those provisions were enacted. But on top of that theories, the realization that it's not about restraint versus activism, not about this quote unquote strict construction as Nixon talked about and conservatives talked about into the 80s. It's about, okay, what is your theory? And then let's apply it. Okay, because if you have a great theory, but then you're not willing to go against strike down government action or overturn precedent, then what good is your theory in the first place? And so that's really the difference between a John Roberts and a Sam Alito, to take the two justices appointed by George W. Bush, for example. And so you have multiple generations as the conservative legal movement has developed and sharpened its theory, that it's really gone against a more loosey-goosey, pragmatic or evolutionary or whatever you want to call it, results-oriented or not, theory that we come from the left.
But doesn't Kavanaugh represent a disconfirming case for your argument, right? In other words, my observation was that it almost had nothing to do with his judicial philosophy, right? And I think at one point in the book you point out the irony is that Kavanaugh was viewed as a safe pick. That's why Trump nominated him.
Yep.
So that this to me is sort of like an aberration. The fight wasn't about whether, Kavanaugh, how he was going to rule on, pro-life issues or Citizens United or things like that.
Well, but that's why the opposition was so vehement, because Kavanaugh was a safe pick in the sense that he was in the conservative mainstream. The left considers anybody who's, to the right of Merrick Garland to be extreme, basically. And so even though, if you kind of put issue by issue, compare Kavanaugh to Kennedy, from the progressives' perspective, Kavanaugh doesn't change that much, probably on affirmative action, possibly on a couple of other smaller issues, but whether it's Citizens United and campaign finance, where Kennedy was a leader in upholding First Amendment values, whether it's Obamacare, where, Kennedy read the dissent from the bench going against what John Roberts did, a whole host of areas where, it's not that big a shift, but he was a more solid originalist, a more, conventional conservative, if you will. And so that is what alarmed the left. So it was perhaps a surprising pick, a swamp creature like Brett Kavanaugh, double Ivy, inside the Beltway, elite, all of that. But in a sense, Trump likes that gold plating, particularly for his judges. And more importantly, I guess, in this scenario, Don McGahn, the then White House counsel, really liked Kavanaugh for his pushback on the administrative state, which I think is going to be borne out, because that's a major issue as well.
Well, that I think gets to the bigger issue, right, which is as much as these fights seem more dramatic, confirmation fights seem more dramatic in the Senate. And one of the things you point out in your book, correct me if I'm wrong, is that most, or at least half of American presidents from Washington on have had a nominee go down. And then John Quincy Adams had one postponed indefinitely, which is
I love that euphemism. Yeah.
Great phrase. I have like guitar and piano lessons postponed indefinitely in a variety of other projects in my house. Back then it was more an insider's game, and some of the nominees didn't even really have judicial bona fides, whereas today it has become a actual judicial philosophy game, correct?
That's right. Politics always played a role, but often it was about your cronies or satisfying a few senators for their cronies, or geographical balance, the New York seat, the Virginia seat, the Ohio seat, the Southern seat, etc. But it wasn't, you're right, about ideologies. Sometimes there were certain issues, whether it be slavery or railroad regulation, certain other progressive era tropes, antitrust, trust busting under Teddy Roosevelt. But it wasn't kind of that's a conservative, that's a liberal, or what have you. That changed in the 20th century, where ideology as such became the political factor, not just partisanship. And that's what Teddy Roosevelt and his successor, William Howard Taft, referred to as, quote, the real politics. So they, a number of presidents appointed both Democrats and Republicans, but, they focused on what issue they really cared about, whether that's going easy on the business community, whether that's trust busting, whether that's, civil rights issues, pro or con. But regardless of the partisan labels. And then as I said, in the modern age, as kind of the different interpretive theories coalesced into clearly progressive and clearly conservative or originalist, we have the birth of the dynamic that we see now.
But would you agree that, sort of lurking in the back of that, is the confirmation fights have grown more intense and more focused on judicial philosophy because the court itself has grown more powerful, because Congress has grown less powerful and granted, also via ambiguous law and, granting administrative fiat to the executive branch, all sorts of nonsensical legislation that the court then has an opportunity to interpret depending on their appetite for it?
That's definitely a big part of the dynamic, and I describe that in my book. So Ben Sasse, in his opening remarks at the Kavanaugh hearings, touched on this. The reason why the courts or one of the reasons why the courts are so fraught, and there's a fight over them, and there's more protesters in front of the Supreme Court than in front of Congress, which is ridiculous, is because Congress has been passing these broad pieces of legislation, the Truth, Beauty, and Goodness Act of 2020, and then the administrative agencies, the cabinet departments, and others have to flesh out and write the regulations by which we actually have to abide in our daily lives. And of course, you can't unelect bureaucrats. You can only sue them. And so all of these debates over values end up in the courts in that manner, rather than having them hashed out in Congress, which is where we're supposed to decide policy differences and values differences and what have you. But also, before you even get to that warping or skewing of power away from Congress, and yes, someone from Cato, I'm saying that Congress should have more power. Not in the absolute, but rebalancing within the federal government. But anyway, even before you get to that rebalancing and separation of power question, you get the federalism question. That is, Washington, the federal government, is not supposed to be amassing so much power in the first place. So, of course, people from California and Texas and Wisconsin and Virginia are going to disagree about all sorts of different issues. Well, shouldn't we then minimize the issues that are decided in a one-size-fits-all dynamic, rather than letting each state figure those things out? So those two dynamics generally do accentuate the role of the court, the power of the judiciary, and therefore the importance of these fights. Now, some controversial judicial opinions or involvements are unavoidable. Abortion or Second Amendment, these things about individual rights. There's no way, even if you have a properly balanced federal government and federalism is realigned so states are using more of their own sovereignty rather than Washington taking it up, there's still going to be fights over whether a state is violating my First Amendment rights, my Fifth Amendment rights, my 14th Amendment unenumerated rights to whether it's due process or privileges or immunities. So the court is still going to have to figure out which rights and enforce those are protected by the federal Constitution. But the warping of federalism and separation of power certainly accentuates the federal judiciary and the Supreme Court.
So let's say you, Ilya Shapiro, are a United States senator, and you're allowed to be now. You're both old enough, and you're an American citizen.
I haven't been a citizen for, I think it's 14 years you have to.
Oh, okay. Well, however many years to get to you to that point.
I'm not even quite eligible to be a representative yet. Although my home state of Ontario doesn't have any representation in Congress. I think we should maybe make it a state along with D.C. or something.
I am on record supporting what I call the Wexit, which is
a variety
of provinces in Canada that are like the Midwest of Canada. Voted for conservatives.
Yes, I loved your half-baked ideas episodes with Jonah Goldberg on The Remnant, who I'm hoping will invite me to talk about my book. It's been over a year. I've been on 3 times. I'm hoping to make the 5-time club on The Remnant. But anyway, maybe you can tell Jonah that he needs to help me on. But yes, the Wexit is great. And yeah, you wouldn't want Ontario anyway. Great hockey, but they're all going to vote socialist, and we don't want that.
So however it happens, you're in the Senate. Let's say a highly progressive president AOC nominates a very progressive person to be the next Supreme Court justice. How do you approach that nomination? Are you of the opinion that, and let's say this person is otherwise impeccably qualified, you just happen to disagree with their judicial philosophy, right? But high integrity, impeccable credentials. I don't know who the example of that would be in the present day. But they're not an originalist, not a textualist. How do you as a U.S. Senator approach that? Do you believe that you vote against someone because you disagree with their philosophy, or?
Yes.
Okay. Well, you get off the train there.
Judicial philosophy matters. It's not simply whether someone, got great grades and has a sterling resume. I want the Constitution interpreted as I want it interpreted, and fine, you can argue with me if I'm wrong about that. But I do not blame senators for voting against judicial nominees who they think are bad for the rule of law or for constitutional interpretation. Now, they should be honest about that and not hide behind, whatever other pretextual reasons. But the right debate to have is over the correct interpretive theory, and then the voters can ultimately judge whether that senator is making the right call.
But do you believe, so does that basically mean, though, that pre-nuclear option, no one could get confirmed absent a supermajority in the Senate? Or am I getting that wrong?
I suppose you have to make some compromises at a certain point, but different senators, I guess, face different electoral incentives. Yeah, you didn't tell me in this hypothetical whether I'm in safely to get reelected or whether I need some crossover appeal or what have you. But I mean that's always a consideration. But I do think judicial philosophy is absolutely a valid consideration.
What about the Merrick Garland rule? Did McConnell take the right approach? Has that set a standard that we're now going to have to live by for time immemorial?
Well, historically, the last time that someone was confirmed by a Senate of an opposing party to the president to a vacancy that arose during a presidential election year was 1888. It just doesn't happen that often. In periods of united government, it does happen from time to time. In fact, it's even happened during lame ducks. It's happened during lame ducks after the president nominating the person has lost re-election. 9 times that's happened. It's a purely political discussion. And so I haven't yet written this op-ed. Well, during the Merrick Garland, I was saying, what the Republicans are doing are justified. The voters seem to be confused. They reelected Obama in 2012, then gave the Republicans the Senate in 2014. So, take this position that let this election decide who gets to make that nomination. And now, you don't make a lot of money betting on the steel and the spines of Republican senators, but they held together. It's rather remarkable. Now is a different scenario because the president and the Senate are aligned politically. And so, it's again, a purely political calculation. If there's a vacancy tomorrow, should Mitch McConnell then try to push that through? Go for it. What do they have to lose? The Democrats might pack the court regardless. If it happens in the lame duck, I don't know. The consequences, you have to think about the political consequences. There's going to be rioting in the streets regardless, I think. But again, this is pure politics. This is nothing. No maneuver would go against precedent. No maneuver would be illegal or unconstitutional.
All the more reason for a diversionary invasion of Canada to distract from some of these issues.
Why,
I'm joking.
Why not Greenland?
Well, that's step one. It's all part of this process of encircling.
Have you been playing too much Risk, perhaps?
And I'm fine with challenging Trudeau to a fight to settle the land dispute as well. Okay. Let's plant the flag in. Now I'm forgetting what you just. Packing the court, and come back to it. You towards the end of your book, you talk a lot about potential reforms to the court. Let's assume that Congress never starts to jealously guard its own authority and take back some of the authority that it's given away. In the absence of that, what are some options for the Supreme Court to act more responsibly? What reforms of the court do you support personally?
So ultimately, all these reform proposals are rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, and because the Titanic is not the confirmation process, it's the ship of state. And so we've talked about why we have this dynamic and why it's fraught, and so only when the court rebalances our constitutional order by enforcing federalism and separation of powers are we going to decrease that temperature. But in terms of any of the reforms, packing the court is it's possibly one of the only things, maybe the only thing I agree with Bernie Sanders on. He was interviewed. I'm not going to do the accent, but he said, you start packing the court in 50 years, there are going to be 87 justices. This is insane. And that's right. And historically, the party that has packed the court or added justices, they might gain some, very short term benefit, but long term they lose. It's not a winning play long term. There's some more exotic court expansion or restructuring schemes like, well, what if there's 15 justices, but 5 are designated Republican, 5 are Democrat, and the other 5 have to be unanimously agreed upon by the partisan justices? Well, how does it depoliticize the court to have 2/3 of the justices with explicitly partisan affiliations? That's a little too clever by half. Term limits is the one that gets talked about the most, especially when there hasn't been turnover in the court's personnel in a while. Like Justice Breyer, between 1994 and 2005, Justice Breyer was the junior justice for 11 years. It was just remarkable, and so a lot of momentum for term limits. The problem with that is it would take a constitutional amendment. Now, again, because judges are supposed to serve during good behavior, some academics have proposed, well, we'll just make them senior justices, and they retain all of their salaries and whatever else, and they can serve in lower courts. I'm like, well, maybe, but that's not what the Constitution says. I mean, I think again, it doesn't really work. Term limits is the common thing would be 18 years. So there's a vacancy every 2 years during off years. So not during the year where there's a House or a presidential election. If people would like the court more or feel more confident in the court, if that were to happen, sure, let's talk about that. But to be clear, that wouldn't really change the ideological mix of the court over time. In the last 50 years, there have been 30 years of Republican presidents, 20 years of Democratic presidents. So if anything, liberal voices have been overrepresented on the court. And if you do kind of like the game theory about who would be on the court now, it would be three George W. Bush appointees, four George W. Bush appointees, four Obama and two Trump. Anyway, I mean, it's the balance would be roughly the same. So people wouldn't even be younger, because if you're only having 18-year terms, then folks in their 60s would start being eligible again. But that's the only one, term limits, that I guess I mildly support. Steve Calabresi, one of the co-founders of the Federalist Society, has a voluminous, exhaustive article about this in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy that convinced me. But again, it would take a constitutional amendment, and it wouldn't change how the court actually rules. So there you go.
So it sounds like you're basically saying that Article 1 needs to get its act together, and there's nothing that the third branch of government can do on its own to fix some of our bigger problems.
That's right. I blame you, Mike. You personally are. No, all the branches are to blame. Article 3 absolutely can start ruling in better ways to hold Congress's feet to the fire, to hold the executive branch agencies' feet to the fire, sending back more power to the states and localities. Congress can legislate more clearly, and the executive can stop using creative ways of expanding its own power, of employing this idea of, when Congress doesn't act, well, I will, with the pen and the phone and the tweet and what have you.
I did used to do this thing where whenever I was speaking to a conservative group, Politico had this ongoing series that was like 100 things Trump did while you weren't looking. And I'd read it for conservative audience, they'd be like, oh yeah, awesome. Because it's all stuff we liked. But I tried to make the subversive point that this should anger you, because anything done through executive order is inherently impermanent and will be undone by a pen and a phone the next time someone else comes in that we don't like. But I'm not sure I made that argument that effectively.
Unless it's immigration reform and John Roberts is the deciding vote, I guess. In that DACA case, by the way, I filed a brief which got me some notoriety. On the cover, it says supporting DACA as a matter of policy and the government as a matter of law. And people were very confused. What do you mean your policy preferences diverge from your legal analysis? How can that be possible?
Process matters. This is not this is bowling. There are rules. So we have about 13 minutes left. I need 5 of those to talk about lowbrow Netflix things. I want to give you a choose your own adventure. We can either have you analyze in real time the list that Trump just put out, or we can talk about your weed article in National Affairs, or we can talk about Citizens United. You get to choose one of those 3 paths.
Weed, Citizens United, and what was the other one?
You can analyze in real time the Trump list that just came out.
Apparently it hasn't come out. There's going to be an announcement at some time.
Okay.
So I guess that's off the table. But I do have an article a few weeks ago I put out about these are the people that Trump needs to add to his list. And it's basically the 14 people from the previous 25-person list who are under 55, plus 11 new ones who are basically Trump-appointed lower court judges who are phenomenal, and 3 academics as a wild card. But anyway, we'll see who he actually picks. I
Who's
don't
gonna
know.
guess
Who's
who's
going to make the final
three?
Who do you think it's going to be?
Well, the thing is, if it's for the Ginsburg seat, then it's going to be a woman. But if it's not the Ginsburg seat, then it can be anyone. So the list has to be long, comprehensive enough to include all that. So for the Ginsburg seat, I think the final three would be Amy Coney Barrett of the Seventh Circuit, Naomi Rao of the D.C. Circuit, and I'll say Joan Larson of the Sixth Circuit.
Interesting. I don't play.
If it's someone else, then Amul Thapar, who's on the Sixth Circuit and is a favorite. He was the first circuit judge appointed by Trump, and he's a big supporter, or Mitch McConnell is his big patron, so he'll be very competitive.
Okay, well then, having covered that in a short period of time, I'm going to ask you about your marijuana article, and I just want to read the first paragraph because I think this is a beautiful bit of writing. And I'm obsessed with teaching kids how to write because I think it's very important. I think it's why Scalia was so effective and renowned, because he wrote in a way that was both understandable and fun. And this is that. So this is your...
Hopefully you're picking a paragraph that I actually wrote rather than Yuval Levin rewriting.
Well, either way, you should take credit for it. It's the opening paragraph. He said, can something be legal and illegal at the same time? That may sound impossible, but has increasingly become reality for cannabis in the United States. As more and more states legalize marijuana while Congress stands pat and the executive branch works out enforcement complexities, people across the country are asking themselves, what is this magical Schrodinger's weed? That's a great framing. All right, so you sort of tee up this massive contradiction we have where weed is legal in a lot of states, but it's illegal at the federal level. And maybe tell us how we should think about this from a constitutional perspective.
Sure. So I basically give a survey of constitutional law as it's been warped by the drug war. And my point isn't to advocate any particular kind of marijuana or broader drug policy, although you can tell my sympathies from this article. It's the process point. It's about how, in our zeal to prosecute the drug war, we've warped everything from the Commerce Clause, the Raich versus Gonzalez case in 2005, that allows the federal government now to regulate or prohibit a plant that you grow in your own backyard for your own consumption, to the Fourth Amendment, because whenever we hear about cops knocking down doors and no-knock raids and stop and frisk and stuff, it's one of two things. It's guns or drugs. To a whole host of other parts of either the Bill of Rights or government powers. And I kind of go through the Constitution and show how the drug war has led to an expansion of federal and executive power in these areas, as well as violating our individual rights. It's quite stunning. And I think regardless of what you think about what marijuana or broader drug policy should be, the way that it's affected, whatever your pet issue might be, whether it's foreign policy or race relations, there's an aspect of it that's been touched by the drug war.
Well, so if I agree with those arguments, wouldn't the logical thing to do would be to say, okay, we should decriminalize it at the federal level and then allow states to determine how they want to deal with it?
Sure.
And I would support that it would remain illegal in Wisconsin because I think weed makes you stupid and lazy. Is that a defensible intellectual position?
I think it is. Again, as long as you're then not using the police to search everybody just in case they might have weed, or some of the pretextual reasons for probable cause. Some of these things for drug courier profiles in the FBI, and this has been adopted by various police forces around the country. So listen to this. Here are traits that fit a drug courier profile. Appearing nervous, making phone calls shortly after arriving, having little or no luggage, having a significant amount of luggage, using public transit, paying cash for a ticket, also departing the plane first, departing the plane last, departing the plane in the middle, steering with your hands at 2 and 10, steering with your hands at 3 and 9. It's just remarkable what
that brings
cops
to
will come
mind
up with.
The Smithsonian analysis of things that are white privilege. It's the scientific method, Not like jaywalking. Yeah, like
so you quoted a paragraph from the very beginning. I'll quote you a paragraph from the very end. This is not the very last paragraph, but here's my conclusion. The war on drugs has been fought largely with laws that were beyond Congress's powers to enact. Although it took a constitutional amendment to allow Congress to prohibit alcohol nationwide, the prohibition of now illicit substances under the Controlled Substances Act took place without any such amendment. This is perhaps mainly a commentary on the Supreme Court's expansive reading of the Commerce Clause, but it should give pause to anyone who takes the Constitution seriously.
Well put. And freely available online. You don't even need to subscribe to National Affairs to get it. I shouldn't say that. Yuval would be mad at me, but such is life. Okay, in the minutes we have remaining here, so first of all, people can go. Your book can be ordered on Amazon right now.
Right. There is a dedicated website, supremedisorder.com. But yeah, if you look up my name, Ilya Shapiro, the book's title, Supreme Disorder, on Amazon, you can find it there. And I tell you what, if I'll make this offer to your listeners, if you order it, it comes out officially in 2 weeks, but you can pre-order it, and you send me that proof of purchase and your address, I'm happy to send a signed book plate that you can stick in, since I won't be visiting a bookstore near you anytime soon.
Well, I have tens of listeners on this podcast, and so my mom will probably buy it and send it to you. So
fantastic.
You've sold one book, probably. I'm not allowed to advocate the buying of this book. I'm just merely pointing out that it is available on Amazon, and it's a very good book. So whatever, ethics people, that I've done my due diligence. Okay, in the time we have remaining, obviously you're impressing us with the many leather-bound books on your bookshelf. Do you make time to read fiction, or is it all boring legal briefs and SCOTUS blog this and stuff like that?
Yeah, I read legal thrillers, of course. John Grisham. Well, not just that. I read a lot of different things. I try to always have something in current affairs on the go, something historical, and then some fiction. Now, don't put me on the spot by asking me what I'm reading that's fiction now. I don't know, because I can only remember the very last thing I looked at, which right now is my own book, In Your Face. So, but I do try to read fiction. I feel like eventually I'll want to write some fiction, but I feel I don't know enough about the world yet to make that happen.
You could do like a legal thriller, though. That's you could tell the tale of a young congressman struggling to reclaim Article I authority from the evil careerists. I'm just throwing it out there as a potential. Okay. And invade Canada as a means of revitalizing Manifest Destiny.
Using his CIA training, right?
That's right. Okay, what about even lower brow addictions? I mean, in the pandemic, we've all been forced to watch Tiger King.
I've watched Tiger King. What my wife and I are watching now is Cobra Kai. The latter-day expansion of the Karate Kid universe. We think it's entertaining and well done. And
I'm trying to convince my wife to watch this with me. I think the premise is brilliant.
I think she might be too young, because for me it's all this 80s nostalgia that's just fantastic. But I think the characters don't take themselves too seriously, which I always appreciate. And it's always these tropes, and it's also these like vicious karate kicks to the head that apparently like don't hurt anybody. So it's this cartoon violence. So yeah, it's good fun. And my wife is not into violence, cartoon or otherwise, or martial arts or what have you. And I think she's more a fan of it than I am, frankly.
And correct me if I'm wrong, the whole premise is that the bad guy in the original Karate Kid, he's the main character in this one. And I sort of got the vibe that the subtext was going to be he's teaching kids to be more hardcore in a world that no longer values those virtues.
That's right. They're soft and pushovers, and the quote unquote losers in their high school, and they all flock to the Cobra Kai dojo to learn strike first, no mercy, all that sort of thing. But yeah, so he's in his 50s and is kind of down and out, just lost his job, and he's resurrecting his life. And then Daniel, who was the Karate Kid and won that tournament, is now the used car salesman king of Southern California.
California.
Yeah.
Speaking of 80s nostalgia, do you have strong thoughts on the Top Gun sequel that should be coming out soon?
I think it's a travesty that they changed the flags on the flight jacket to soothe the Chinese censors. But I'm going to watch the movie. I'm a big Top Gun fan. I'm possibly a bigger fan of the Top Gun soundtrack. I mean, I thought the music was fantastic. And I have my drug war article notwithstanding, I have a need for speed.
Well played. It's even worse though if you look at the flags on Maverick's bomber jacket or whatever it is. They took the Japanese flag and they turned the circle into a triangle in the middle, and then on the Taiwan flag they just kept the colors and rearranged the shape. Yeah. So it's all nonsensical. Okay, this is my penultimate question. Who are kind of your legal mentors? Who do you model yourself after?
Randy Barnett. Who's a Georgetown law professor, the godfather of the challenge to Obamacare. Richard Epstein, whom I had at the University of Chicago Law School for property, corporations, and Roman law. And he's just this eminence grise of the libertarian legal movement, remarkable individual. And Roger Pilon, who hired me into Cato and has not published as many books as these other gentlemen, but has certainly within Washington legal policy circles made a big implant.
Well, actually, this is my penultimate question. What percentage of bills that Congress passes into law do you think are actually, based on a fair reading of the Constitution, unconstitutional?
I think probably if you're rounding down, zero.
Zero are actually constitutional.
That's right.
Okay.
Well, I mean, naming post offices. I mean, these days Congress doesn't do much other than pass continuing resolutions and name post offices. So the naming the post offices is constitutional.
You'll support that one, okay? Okay. Final.
That's actually an enumerated power over post offices and postal roads. So.
This is true. But there's a lot of misinformation surrounding the post office, as you may have heard recently. Okay. Final question for Ilya Shapiro. Author of Supreme Disorder, available on Amazon, wherever books are sold. Let's say you come to Green Bay, Wisconsin, because you need to exercise yourself of your Broncos past. You come to the Mecca of football, and we're having a beer in the shadow of Lambeau Field, and a young Wisconsinite comes up to you and says, Mr. Shapiro, I heard you on the New Look podcast. I'm a huge fan of your work. I read your book, and it has inspired me to go to law school, and I really want a career like yours as a legal scholar, a constitutional scholar. What advice would you have for that young Wisconsinite?
Well, it's kind of like when someone approaches you and wants to convert to Judaism. You say no several times, and then finally you're like, okay, if you're persistent enough, let's talk about whether you have the right reasons for doing this. Because going to law school, most lawyers are miserable or not fulfilled, or they go to law school and become lawyers as a default because they don't know what to do with their life. Also, there are very few jobs as constitutional lawyers. So, chances are you'll end up doing something else, and again, will be miserable and unfulfilled. So it's also a credentials game. So if you don't have, the top grades at the top schools, or, it's just tough to break into that sort of thing. There are definitely more opportunities now than when I was graduating law school, 17 years ago, because there are state-based think tanks, including in Wisconsin, that have legal organizations, legal arms, and especially you can get internships and, eventually maybe even create a position for yourself. More donors are doing this these days. But really it's just, get good grades, read a lot of books, get good grades in law school, clerking is very important. So you learn how the judiciary actually works, and create your own luck, become expert on something that, something that nobody else is. Get your name out there by writing, by doing, there are now these young voices organizations that you can join and start making a media clips file as well. You have to be entrepreneurial in your career, and you have to be the owner of your career. Nobody's going to lay out. It's very easy to become, go to a law firm or go to a prosecutor's office or something like that. Lots of those kinds of jobs. But if you really want to be an idea entrepreneur, which is how I characterize my job, at the intersection of the legal, political, academic, and media worlds, you really have to be innovative and figure out where, not just substantively what you want to write about or talk about, become expert in, but where the opportunities are.
Great advice from Ilya Shapiro, the once and future legal viceroy of the conquered territories of Canada. Ilya, thanks for taking some time. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, and I hope your tens of listeners have enjoyed this.
They certainly have.
The dude